Hello. Welcome, everybody. We are here at the top of the hour in the BHive, hosting this month's installment of our SME Suite. This one is going to be really awesome because it is selfishly a cause that is very near and dear to my heart, and that is why higher ed struggles to change. So I have been in the higher ed space for the past 8 or so years, more from the ed tech side of things, shifting from product at startups to where I am with Beyond Academics here today, which is more on the services, consulting side of things. And I'm starting to notice that there's a bit of a shift, but it all has this underlying similarity. So when I was in product, everything was about adoption. Will the faculty adopt this product? Will the administrators adopt this product? How do we get scaled adoption in a sustainable way? That was the push. That was the focus. Now, sitting where I'm at and beyond, and more of a consultative lens, it's more about how do we drive mindset? And what I'm realizing is that there is a huge link between mindset and adoption. That common thread is relationships, right? Do I have a good relationship with this person? Do I trust what they're saying in order for me to adopt this new technology or adopt this new way of thinking? And so I'm really pumped because today we have Greg Satell in the house. He is the author of Cascades. He is the change maker of all change makers. And he's going to talk to us a little bit today about change management, what it is. It's so intangible, right? We're going to get to the heart of it. And then we're going to look at it through a higher ed lens to focus on what you can do today in the evidence-based, research-backed processes that will facilitate that change. So I'll let Greg introduce himself a little bit, and then, of course, we'll kick it off to Matt and get this conversation started.
Thanks so much for having me, Nicole. I'm really excited to be here, and I think there's such an amazing potential to change education, and more specifically, to identify and overcome resistance to change, because that's really the key. And I think the biggest misconception about change is it is as people treat it as if it's some hero's journey where you start with a vision, and if you're good enough and smart enough and you do all the right things and your cause is righteous, eventually you'll get to that place. But that's not the case at all. The true story of change is a strategic conflict between that alternative future vision and the status quo. And the status quo always has sources of power keeping it in place. And those sources of power have an institutional basis. And that's what you need to understand and be able to influence if you're ever going to have a chance of making change succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I can't wait to dive in and pick your brain for our audience. And please, anyone who is listening live, feel free to throw any questions for Greg in the chat at any point. We can throw his website in the comments so that you can just take a look at what he's really passionate about and interested in, and ask questions or come up on stage accordingly. And I'll kick it over to Matt to just introduce himself and any other housekeeping logistics items before we get started.
Well, for the folks that are normally in the BHive, you know who I am. I'm Matt Allen, a part of the Beyond team. This is a little bit of a reunion. Like Greg and I, during the COVID time, we were in Clubhouse and we were on stages having conversations. I didn't know Greg that well, but man, the conversations that we used to have, and I used to sit in the listening lounge, and him and Todd McLeese just going off around change. And I'm thinking, my God, this is what higher ed needs. So when Nicole suggested bringing Greg on, I was like, damn right, let's get Greg on. Because I think, everyone sees my posts on LinkedIn and they feel it's a little sharp, but every one of my narratives is about a change conversation. It's about shedding light on the obvious, the things that we know that we need to change, but we just are okay with the status quo. We know we accept the norms, right? And then we are in a very incumbent-led organization in higher ed where they benefit from keeping it the same way. But yet our learners require us to change, just the way that we change in retail and in travel and all these things, right? Change is so important. So I'm so glad to have you here, Greg. I'm really appreciative of Nicole driving this conversation. For the folks that are new to the BHive, you'll see that Gabrielle and Ro are in the chat. Go ahead and have a conversation. Usually the chat is blowing up, so Gabrielle is going to be the voice of the chat. She'll jump on. Go ahead and say hi. Like Clubhouse, you can also jump onto the stage. So if you want to get on stage, just let us know in the chat. We'll do there. You may also see that we just invite you up. The only thing we ask is turn on your camera so that you can get onto stage and have a conversation with us. We really believe that your voice matters. This is a conversation. So as you put your comments on, you will see that we will also maybe publish it on the stage where Greg and Nicole and I can maybe address it at any point in time. So without further ado, Nicole, it's all yours, and take it from here.
All right. Well, I think a good way to maybe get started is to understand that change management is not a one and done. And something that I think all three of us can agree with is it's not a fancy communications plan. It's not training. It's a lot more intangible than what many vendors or even consultants are putting out there. This is more of an ongoing process. And I would love if, Greg, you could shed a little bit of light, because some of your more recent articles that you've been posting on Medium are honing into that human skills, things like empathy, generosity. What are these intangibles, human skills that contribute to more successful transformation, innovation, and change? Can you touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, I do want to address the issue of change management a little bit.
Oh yeah, please.
Because change management, and it's one of the reasons I don't say I do any change management is actually a specific methodology. I mean, you're talking to and really that was made for another era, for when most of the strategic assets, most of the assets in an organization were tangible assets, things like factories and offices and real estate and these things. Back in 1975, more than 80% of organizational assets were tangible assets. This is in the private sector, not higher ed, but similar trends, I would think. By 2015, more than 80% of strategic of assets, corporate assets, are intangible assets. So intellectual property, licenses, all those types of things. So when we talked about change, when the practice of change management first arose in the early 1980s, was to address that first type of change. So somebody high up in the organization would make a decision about a strategic asset, and change management was really designed to communicate that change, and to your point, maybe equip the workforce with change, with the skills they needed. If you're going to go into a new market, you need to make those investments. You need to train your sales staff, your marketing staff on how to sell and market and service those new products. But today, when we talk about change, invariably, we're talking about changes in what people think and what they do. And those types of mindset, behavioral changes, people will tend to resist. And you need to identify, anticipate, and address that resistance if change is ever going to have a chance to succeed. That's why one of the first things we do when we sit down with an organization, whether that's in higher ed or somewhere else, is to go through a resistance inventory. We've identified 5 evidence-based categories of resistance. 4 are rational, 1 is not, and that's pretty much step 1. Understand where the resistance is going to come from, so that you can anticipate and build strategies to mitigate it rather than just waiting for it to happen and reacting.
Yeah, and I want to dive into one of the comments in the chat, but before I do so, you're saying take this resistance inventory, know where your landmines are going to be. Does that become more tangible, or is that still something that's living in the intangible? Is it truly a document where we're writing a matrix of, this person's definitely going to be against it? What does that actually look like in practice?
So the 4 rational sources of resistance are lack of trust,
Okay.
change fatigue, switching costs, and then competing incentives or commitments. So each of them you want to go through and think about, are people going to trust us? Right? So if we are putting in this program or technology, what are the trust issues that are going to arise? And having that conversation, you're not going to be able to anticipate everything, but having that conversation from day one is really valuable. Change fatigue. How many initiatives do we have going on right now? How many initiatives have failed in the last few years? How much is this a change that we really need to pursue? When I was still running organizations, people would say, we need to change this. And I'd say, yeah, I know we need to, but we're not going to, because we're putting in these things now, and we're going to, the organization can only take so much stress. Switching costs, right?
Yep.
How is the change? To what extent is it really outperforming the status quo? And what's it going to cost for them to make that change? And are they going to be willing? And then the 4th one is competing incentives. Are we paying people to do one thing and asking them to do another?
That's higher ed in a nutshell, baby.
Yeah. And also lots of times people have internal commitments they've made. For instance, Matt, how many times have you seen a manager that wanted to delegate, but saw herself as a hands-on manager?
Yeah.
So that's an internal commitment that needs to be resolved.
Yeah.
And then finally, you have the last category, which is a resistance related to identity, dignity, and sense of self. We can ask people to change what they think or do, but we can't ask them to change who they think they are. And that's why anytime we set out to change what people think and do, there's always going to be some who see it as an affront to their identity, dignity, sense of self, and they're going to resist in ways that are dishonest and underhanded and deceptive. And that doesn't make them bad people.
Right.
If we're honest with ourselves, we all do it, right? Anybody who's ever been married or in a relationship knows that. We all form attachments to people, ideas.
I was going to say, this is triggering a few other things outside of higher ed for me.
But understanding that and not making moral judgments about people's willingness to adopt change, that's where you can start really making some good strategic decisions.
If you notice, I'm like scribbling here. I'm doing all the things that we should be doing on a stream. I'm like writing like a master class notes here. Man, if we could layer some of the stuff around the things that we see in higher ed and say, hey, a lot of times people are just jumping into implementations, Greg, spending millions of dollars, and they don't get the trust conversation even going. They just believe that it's going to happen to this. We're going to go do it, but they don't gain the trust. And that becomes because there is no light shed on the vision that everyone needs to understand. Why are we going here? There's a sense of trust when you drive that. The change fatigue, I can't tell you the number of systems that are being put in, number of processes and policies because every time there's an issue, there's a new change of some strategy trying to fix that issue, as opposed to like thinking. So I mean, I can go through all of these things really quickly, and I do think maybe, Greg, we probably need to work together on
Yeah, there's going to be a follow-up.
One thing there, if I can add one thing, because everybody seems to talk about Clayton Christensen's work, but very few people seem to have read it. This disruption conversation, we have glorified disruption, where managers like to be seen as disrupting. And this whole idea of creating a sense of urgency around change, that's the dumbest idea of all the things said about change. What you want to do is create a sense of safety around change.
Yeah.
I can give you just one example that I love from Russell Lowry Hart, who I think you may know.
Yeah, the president of
at Amarillo College. Now he's at Austin, right?
Yeah, Austin Community College.
By the way, is an upcoming guest on my podcast, Changemaker
Oh, exciting.
Mindset. We've recorded it. It should be out in October, hopefully.
Nice.
But one of the things, very much to your point, Matt, we look at a behavior and we say we want to change that behavior. We don't like that behavior. Something about it we don't like. And so we always default to incentives. We say, okay, change the incentives, you change behavior. Never works, right? The reason why it doesn't work is because culture is made up of, among other things, behaviors, norms, and rituals. And unless you address those rituals and norms that underlie the behavior is never going to change.
Yeah.
So Russell, as you know, within like 5 years, transformed Amarillo from an underperforming place with completion rates at around 19% to an Aspen Prize winning institution with completion rates in the low 60s. One of the things he said is, we're not a suburban school where people come in here, they're 18-year-olds and whatever. Our typical student is a 27-year-old woman with 3 kids who's trying to get her life back on track. And these people have had terrible relationships with institutions, and certainly not relationships that built a whole lot of trust. So one of the big obstacles, one of the behaviors they had to change, was people would come in on the first day of class, and they'd come to the parking lot and they'd turn around and drive right back out because they were so intimidated.
Wow.
So what Russell said, he said, he looked at the first day of class. He didn't put it in these words, but the first day of class is a ritual, right? It encodes
a moment
norms.
that matters. Yeah.
If you think about all the norms that are encoded in the first day of in the ritual of first day of class, the passing out, the Sibyllus, everything. He remade that ritual, and for the first 2 weeks, he created a new ritual where the first 2 weeks of every semester, faculty and staff would be stationed in the parking lot to welcome those new students.
Yeah.
And that encoded this norm, not only for the students, but for the faculty and staff, that we are no longer gatekeepers. We are going to love our students to success.
Wow.
I love the fact that you said gatekeepers, and I want to bring Tina into this conversation. So let's come back to gatekeepers, because I call that out all the time. There's too many gatekeepers in higher ed, and that's why there's always policies and procedures that are creating friction all over campus, because we're putting the burden on the learner, the student, to manage the gatekeeping, right? There's so many gatekeeping concepts and Amazon and Target, but we never feel it. Why? It's done in the back end. But in higher ed, we're like, oh, no, student, you got to do all these 14 steps so I can validate your residency in this world, right? Like these are concepts that we need to really think about. Tina, I know that you've been on stage for a long time, so I apologize for not getting you up earlier, but we want to bring you back into this conversation. I know that your note was that you were presenting some of this at a conference. Would love to hear a little bit more, and you can just chime in and have a conversation with Greg as well.
Thank you. Greg, I thought it was interesting at the beginning when you started talking about how the idea of change is maybe somewhat antiquated at this point, that when it first came out, the idea of a change management plan or change manager was something that maybe isn't what we need today. I work with a very talented change leader who's actually on this call, so that's just a little more nerve-wracking. But really, early on, 2 years ago, we started our implementation work, and I went to her and I said, "We need a change plan," and she kind of looked at me like, why? Do we exactly know what we want to be doing a year from now or 2 years from now? And that took a little bit for me to wrap my head around. And I think a lot of organizations who are embarking on big projects like that sometimes view change as this thing that you can precisely map out the way you would a Gantt chart or a project plan. And what we came to was an approach that was, we were predicting what was going to be the need. We mapped a way to meet that need. And then we continued to listen and carry forward to, oh, now this is the need, and we'll work through it that way. So last year at SCUP, I presented with a coworker, and really the gist of it was, when you're thinking of work like this, like bringing in a new ERP system, it's not really about the technology. So if you can shelve that and focus on, and we were joking, but it actually made it into the presentation, the other F word in the room, which is feelings. And when you start opening and creating space for people to talk about their feelings around a change that throws up everything that they do, you're creating the chance to build trust with them. And now 2 years into the project, my team and I, we have the benefit of people saying, this is making me uncomfortable, but we trust what you've done with us so far. We're willing to continue to ride along with this next phase of these feelings that are making us kind of question, what are we doing? And that's what we shared at the conference. And we continue even a year after the conference, like that approach is working, and it really does a good job of validating their people and the people involved in this change. And at the end, we'll have a new ERP, but we'll have people working differently, and our students will have a different experience as well.
Yeah, so 2 points. One, there's a guy named Ed Hansen who posts a lot on LinkedIn. Very, very different field. He does large scale transformations. He, until recently, was a lawyer, but now has gone. Anyway, he has a great video about what he calls the execution continuum, and he talks very much to your point about how timelines get in the way. Google has a great mantra. They call it monkey first. That if you want to, the idea is, if you want to train a monkey to recite Shakespeare on a pedestal, you train the monkey first. Anybody can build a pedestal. The problem is people will build a pedestal to show progress against a timeline, and say, well, we're 25% to the when. If you can't train the monkey, the pedestal doesn't mean anything. So I definitely look at his work. When I talk about change management, I'm talking about something very, very specific. 30 years ago, there was a Harvard professor who went and did 100 case study interviews, and asked them how they successfully led change. And these executives, I'm sure you'll be shocked to hear, they said, well, the change was successful because I was so brilliant. I'm such a fantastic leader. I created this sense of urgency. I removed obstacles. I turned a phrase. I was just fantastic. And if everybody just did what I did. So he wrote down his findings into 8 steps, which, okay, if you made those case study interviews, or I made those case study interviews, we might have seen it a little bit differently. And here we are 30, 40 years later, and everybody's still, that's when people say the practice of change management, they're talking about either those 8 steps or some derivative that came from one guy's, I missed a step. Then he went to Deloitte. He teamed up to Deloitte like a few years later, and they did 200 case study interviews. And lo and behold, they came up with the same 8 steps he did. I mean, and now, it's been enshrined as if that is actual research, but it isn't. We do have decades of research into how change works. And one of the things, and it goes back to how you build trust. One of the things that we know from, dozens of studies is that change propagates through peer networks. We adopt the changes that we see working around us, not the ones that people hear about, or not the ones that they see communicated. So very much to your point, Tina, if you want to build trust, you actually have to work with people, empower them to succeed. And that's really what a movement is. Movements are not based on persuasion. They're based on empowerment. You build trust by helping others to do the types of things they want to do.
I think that is huge and resonates so much coming from my experience at product companies where we would try and force people to adopt a technology. And obviously they're not going to do that unless they see the value in it of themselves. And I think it goes back to those 4 pillars that you mentioned earlier, like how burnt out are they already from changes? What is the switching cost? All of those things go back into the mindset. But when it comes to bottom line versus mindset, bottom line always seems to win out versus actually empowering and nurturing people and these mindsets within them. So I'm curious, coming from a higher ed lens, and we have Tina on a campus here, and then Greg, who actually is lecturing at a school as well as doing this work himself. If the house is on fire, essentially, with higher ed, right? We have a demographic cliff, we have AI, and we don't know how to control it or do policies around it, or just, enable our people to use it. We have, the highest distrust in higher education that we've ever seen. We have the also highest distrust in leadership in higher ed that we've ever seen, with the most votes of no confidence for presidents, things like that. All of these factors, plus, post-pandemic, still navigating those changes, lack of funding, all of that. What can we do when all of the factors are against us? And we have change makers here in the audience, right? They wouldn't be listening to us if they didn't have these qualities within them. When the mountain is so big, how can you maintain that confidence and that mindset to achieve those kinds of wins and bring about the transformation that is needed? Or else the reality is these campuses might not be here 5 years from now with how fast things are evolving and changing. So a little bit of a big question, a macro issue, but something we all care about.
Funny, we recently had a guy on our podcast, Alistair Martin. Now he's not an educator. Well, he's in healthcare. He's an emergency room doctor. Came up kind of rough. He was also a White House fellow. He's on the faculty of both Harvard Kennedy School and Harvard Medical School, and advises the government on the Department of Health and Human Services. He's somebody who's created his own nonprofit. It's called A Healthier Democracy, and and basically what he does, he leverages the healthcare system to provide services to marginalized groups. So, for instance, the biggest program they do is Vote ER, and he's signed up healthcare professionals to wear a lanyard that says, "Are you registered to vote?" And if the patient isn't registered to vote, if they want, there's a QR code, they can get registered right there in the exam room. And to date, they've registered about 100,000 people to vote in marginalized communities. Now, that's not going to change. That's not going to fix our democracy. It's not going to fix our healthcare system. But here's an emergency room doctor, and Alistair, he said something I thought was so meaningful. He said, you have to understand you can't change everything, but you can change something. He did something. So I think you need to turn the question around that, you know, I don't know whether the system is burning or it isn't. I think probably more realistically, I think there's some things that are working and some things aren't, which is always true and always will be true. So I think the question is more, how can we empower students to learn? What can we do to make a difference? You know, we know from research, and we're talking about decades of research. There's 4 principles that research continually bears out. First, change comes from the outside and always encounters resistance. We know this from the very first studies on hybrid corn and tetracycline. Second, that there's something called a cap gap, or sometimes it's called an information deficit. That shifts in knowledge and attitudes don't necessarily result in shifts in practice. We might know that we shouldn't eat the cookie. It doesn't mean we're not going to eat the cookie, right?
And I always eat the cookie.
Yeah, and we know that there's knowing doing gaps in every organization. Third, that change follows an S curve, right? Meaning it starts off slowly, hits if hopefully at some point hits a tipping point, which unlocks a cascade and exponential growth. So starting fast means nothing, right? There's no reason to have a big launch. If you can start from, and I was talking before about my friend Serja in Serbia. You know, he met with 5 friends. He met with 4 friends. There was 5 of them. The next day, 6 joined them. That made 11. A year later, they were up to like 200-300. So, and it was 1999, and anybody who was looking would say Slobodan Milosevic is going to be dictator for life. A year after that, their movement was 70,000 people. Milosevic was brought down and was on his way to The Hague. From 5 to 11 to 200-300 to 70,000. Change is always nonlinear. So you don't need to convince everybody at once. We know that the tipping point for change is around 10 to 20% participation. So start with that one team, that one process, that one department, that one subject, that one something. Find a success where you can start building that trust because people have seen it work around them. And the last I already mentioned is that change propagates itself through peer networks. People adopt the changes they see around them. So those 4 rules, if what you're doing is in line with them, you're probably going to be okay.
You know, can I address the one question you kind of talked about? How do we get students to think about this change? You know, I'm a big believer that higher ed operates on an earn it model versus a learn it model. So we've always incentivized our students to earn a grade versus learn the knowledge there. So a lot of times the way that they are trying to leverage a campus, they're just trying to figure out how to pass through the gatekeeper's rules of getting a grade of an A, B, or C, right? To get that passing grade. And I really believe in order to change higher ed, we got to get to the learn it model. We have to get to competency-based education where we're starting to drive around the learn it model, which is going to incentivize the learner to learn that way in terms of, hey, I got to learn differently. I got to figure out how to absorb information more differently. Instead of trying to memorize grades, I think right now higher ed is built on that grading system. And that's what they are all gatekeeping. And that's why our systems have policies and procedures all over the place. I'm a believer we have to move it from the earn it to the learn it system, Greg. Would love your thoughts on it. And I know Maya's jumped on the stage too. I'd like to get to her, but would love your thoughts on transforming her around that.
Just really quickly, because I really want to hear what Maya has to say, and this is a really, really important principle. The urge to persuade is pretty much always a red flag. It means you have either the wrong idea or the wrong people.
Yeah.
When I'm in my class, I teach one class, only got 8 students. the success of that class comes down to is highly contingent on the TA, right? Because I'm not going to build the same trustful relationships as my TA will.
Yeah.
So if I can get that TA, if I can empower that TA to empower the students, I'm going to be much, much more successful. That's going to be much, much more successful than anything I say at the front of the class. So instead of trying to persuade, find people who already are enthusiastic about the idea. And how can you empower them to succeed so that they can bring in others who bring in others still? Does that make sense, Alex?
Yeah.
Matt. Sorry.
Yeah, definitely. Maya,
Maya, let's hear from you because I'm obsessed with your tagline, academic life coach, the student empowered. I'm pretty sure we said those lines and then you just appeared. So we want to hear from you.
Like Rumpelstiltskin.
Yes. Oh, and you are on mute. So check that off the bingo card for anyone watching.
This new format has me, I'm like proficient in Zoom. That's it, people. So I actually was on campuses for 20 years and left in the throes of COVID because I was so disappointed with how gatekeeping thrived during COVID. There was immediately this like, here's all the things we can't do versus all of the things that we can do to retain and empower these students in the throes of a crisis. Like my campus students had left for spring break and they were told to not come back. And instead of saying like, this is how we can empower these students, it was, these are all the things we can't do. And after a period of time, like that, I was done pushing the rock uphill.
Hey, Maya.
But, yeah.
Your sound is coming a little bit
like robotic underwater.
Yes.
So,
okay.
Can we try no AirPods? Because your message is amazing, and I want to make sure it's articulated as clearly as possible. And now you went back on mute.
Okay, now is this better?
Yes.
Okay. The AirPods today is not their day. So I took this leap to do really what I've coined academic life coaching, independent of a campus. And the beauty of doing what I do now is that I have the summer to help students and their families, which matters, understand what the incredible differences between K through 12 and higher education. And one of the conversations I have with my students is that you have been taught high school, K through 12, they are teachers. They are professionally trained to teach. They are not trained to enable you to learn. When you get to college, you have to learn. And learning is 100% different than teaching. Teaching is, here's the material. You need to show me that you understand it. And if you don't, we will come back to you and teach till you have perfected the knowledge base. You get to college, professors are researchers, and they're presenting you the subject matter in the context of their research. They aren't going to keep talking about something to make sure every student gets it. To the point of a TA, this is where a TA can make or break a student's success, but also we're putting that expectation on TAs that they understand that they're teachers. And they don't necessarily have the skill set to be teachers, but students may default to thinking that they are the teacher and then have that expectation, and frustration grows. This is something that to me is why the dropout rate is 35 to 40%, is because students and their families have not made that mental leap from teaching to learning. And so then they're frustrated. And then the frustration builds, and then it becomes higher education is exclusive. Higher education does not allow for me to be who I am. Like, the list goes on. And then we continue the problem. And to the point of gatekeeping, this also is a big point, a big problem in student success that first year, because what if, crazy idea, we wrapped RAs, the first year success program, and say somebody within a department, like of the students major, what if we wrapped those through people in to be part of a success team? That's virtually impossible on a large campus, and I'm very clear about that. But these are the little things that are going to help create success. But also, once again, higher ed is struggling to change because there are hundreds of thousands of people in the front lines of higher ed who left during COVID, and now is the crisis of an enrollment cliff and rehiring. How do you make that all happen? So I realize all of my crazy ideas.
Definitely not crazy.
Can I challenge a bit of this?
Oh, yes.
One, I don't think just because you have a title as a professor, you're a great teacher, because most of them are researchers and they've been asked to educate the masses of that. So I think there is that. So even the whether it's a professor that's teaching it or it's an RA, I think there's a lot of places that those professors need to be educated on how to teach and even make the value of that it is their responsibility to knowledge transfer, and they need to do it in the communication style of the learner and the way the learner needs to absorb it. So there's this element. Now, historically, we've never been able to do it because we can't 500 students. But today, with the technologies today, we should have variants of the way that it's being taught. So I think there's that. The other one is we talk about success. Everyone has a different definition of success. In higher ed, student success is different for an administrator than it is for the actual learner. It's different for a faculty than it is for a learner. So I think there is a definition of student success that needs to be defined. Because right now, every time you're trying to do something, the first mantra everyone puts in is, oh, we're doing student success. And yet nobody can actually define what student success and who's student success. Is it student success because you get more funding for completion? Or is it because you now disseminated knowledge and your student has learned it and been able to take it to market and get a job? So there is that definition. I just wanted to push back on those two things and get that conversation, because I think change is needed in these perspectives also.
Matt, I 100% agree with you, 100%, especially the success component, because I feel like that success is like this new, like, we are creating pathways because we are giving people success titles. Success is subjective. It is subjective in every way that you mentioned. And also for Gen Z, what they interpret as success can be everything from becoming a very successful influencer to actually being a first generation, got through the first year of college student. Like, success is just, it is such a broad term. And I think that there is a really critical need to not use it as a blanket word, but to really define what it means for your specific institution and then lead students accordingly.
Can I reframe the question around success? Because I think it becomes much more interesting if you ask, what are the norms and rituals that we use to encode the concept of success? And what behaviors are the result? And if they are not the behaviors that we want, how do we need to change how we are encoding norms through rituals?
Yes. Can I throw up praise hands? Is that inappropriate.
No, and I like this word ritual, which comes out of cultural evolution, because when you start looking at grading, first day of class, admittance, all of these things as sets of rituals, and you start asking how are norms being encoded and what are the behaviors being resulted, then you actually have a mechanism for action. And going back to the original thing about change being a strategic conflict, right? Because you have sources of power that have an institutional basis that are pushing, that have created those rituals. So any institution, you have some obvious ones. I mean, you have faculty, you have you have the institution itself, you have different departments within that institution, you have functional groups, but you also have government, you have outside societies and institutions, you have the businesses that recruit on campus, you have donors. These are all sources of power with an institutional basis that are going to try and shape those rituals. So when we talk about change and we talk about a change strategy, we're always mobilizing people to influence institutions to make changes to those norms, rituals, and behaviors. And that, in a nutshell, that's a big part of what we do in our workshops, is break that down and work it out. So we one of our mantras is, you always start with your targets, not your tactics, right? What are your tactics targeted at? And if you start with good targets, then you can start designing actions that can result in the influence you need to actually make those changes.
Greg, I think that if there was a way that we could tag change and ritual in a conversation, like make that a leading topic, I think that everything.
I thought we just did.
Well, but more so that, like, is higher ed struggling to change because of rituals? Like, I
don't think higher ed is struggling to change because of rituals. I think rituals encode many of the things that, those institutional biases, those norms that might be, those are all encoded through rituals. The ritual itself isn't the problem. The ritual is just a process by which it's encoded. Change always fails for the same reason. It's because people resist it.
One of the things that I think is, when my parents were navigating their careers, college's purpose was different. Like, they came in, when I went through college, the purpose of college was different for me. The purpose of college is definitely different for my kids, but I just look at the ecosystem, the accessibility of education, that we have a different purpose today than we had from the early 60s, 70s, and 80s, where it was a little bit more elite. The era was a little bit more elite. And I think we have to define the purpose of education and for people to recognize it. Because you know what? The Harvards and the Ivies are all going to say, hey, we're building out, a prestigious, academic, side of the world, right? Yet higher ed serves way more people and is going to position them for success. And so the purpose needs to be reinvented, because when we think about the workforce, when we think about, the lifelong learning model with future of work, when we think about future of work and that every time a technology is advancing, the business and the process that we have to reinvent ourselves to manage our industry, education has to be a part of that conversation. And I believe until we start to have a purpose conversation, I don't think higher ed will change. Because if you ask most academics, they're going to say that's their goal is not to educate the masses to get a job. Theirs is to disseminate knowledge, what they have. And I think there is a purpose conversation. And when you all are pushing towards the same purpose, I think that's when higher ed will change. I think that's when you'll have digital wallets where students' courses are on a digital wallet so they can share it among each other. But yet today, we have to go to a registrar's office to get my transcript. Well, that shouldn't be the case anymore. And those are things I think in order for us to change, we have to say, what's the purpose of it? And how do we drive that purpose? And I think change comes from that.
If I can push back a little bit,
sure.
Matt.
That's why you're here, Greg.
I don't think higher education has a purpose. I think institutions of higher education have a purpose. And I think that's so important. You know, Russell Lowry Hart at Amarillo, one of the most important things he said is, we are not a suburban school taking in 18-year-olds. That is not our purpose.
Yeah.
Our purpose is something else. Our purpose is helping these people and doing work, and as well as workforce development for that particular community. He was so crystal clear about his purpose, which would not be the purpose for most institutions. Certainly not for a place like Wharton, where our purpose is very, very different. And especially with the enrollment cliff and everything that's coming, I think every institution needs to say not what is the purpose of education in general, but what is our purpose and how can we empower our students in our community?
You know,
So
really quick, I want to chime in on this. Not to push back on you at all, Greg, but I do believe that you're spot on. Institutions have different purposes, right? And I believe that parents, and like I said, I was one of them. You help your child determine what the education is and what do you value, right? And I look at these 5 value drivers, and I've done a piece on this before. There's a brand value. I want to go to a school because it has a brand. So there's a value to it. Not all community colleges can say I have a brand, but maybe we should. Maybe there should be a brand there, right? There is I want to go to college because I want to gain an experience. There's a value and a purpose in giving my child the experience of going through school and networking and all that. Then there's a specialization from nursing to, you name the different specializations that these different institutions can have. And then, of course, there is this accessibility and convenience of I want to be educated, but I need to be convenient because I work, 2 jobs and I need that. And then there is this affordability. And I believe those 5 value drivers need to be serving different purposes for different institutions. And I think that based on that, if a school can decide what are the value drivers that they bring to the market, I think then they themselves could change how they operate. Because you know what? The way Russell operates is exactly what his school needs, his community needs, the learners need, and the Wharton School has a different purpose and they have a different role in society, right? And I think there's a different purpose. The state schools, the same thing, the mid-markets, you name the schools, right? And I think there's a value driver that comes from purpose.
Right. And if I could just add on to that, I think that really underlines the importance of leadership, because you need a leader to say, this is our purpose and not something else.
Yes.
And when you get a committee and you have, one of these statements where the purpose is 5 different pillars and 3 subsections.
Yep.
The reason why Russell was so successful at Amarillo and why he'll be so successful at Austin, I'm sure, is because he had a very, very clear idea of his purpose. And the reason why he had a very clear idea of his purpose is he created a secret shopper program. And that purpose really came from the students.
I love it. Love it.
And in our podcast episode, he's talking about how Austin is different. The challenges are different. But, and I think the idea of purpose always comes from the question, how do I serve my community? How do I empower?
Yeah. So can I just jump in? Because I love what you're saying, and I agree. Like, having a leader such as Russell is an amazing asset to an institution, because then you get the decisiveness of the vision and the values to bring forward that purpose. But what if there's a president that's not super visionary or having those leadership qualities, but there are people within the institution that are change makers and want to succeed, but they feel these barriers, these gatekeepers, as we talk about it? What can they do? Is there no hope if the top down doesn't see from the bottom up? What happens at that
2
stage?
points. Number one, there's nothing special about Russell. I mean, he's a good guy. He's a smart guy. He just was really clear about what he cares about. I mean, if you meet Russell, that's what
But hey, that can be rare nowadays.
There's no,
let's throw that out there.
There's nothing special. I mean, there's nothing he did that anybody else couldn't do. It's a question of discipline, not talent or ability.
Gotcha. Okay.
If you are, so let's go back to Alistair at A Healthier Democracy. The question isn't whether you can change everything, because you can't. The question is, what can you change?
Mm-hmm.
Right? I know a guy, this is a bit of a self-serving story, middle manager at Procter & Gamble, 35 years old, I think he was. He solved a problem, got an award for it, and he said to the CTO, I'd really like to make this a global program within Procter & Gamble. I think we can. So she said, okay, she gave him some sort of executive minders type of thing. And just then, Cascades came out, and he used it as a model. And I think it was within a year and a half, he built this movement to 2,500 people. I talked to him last fall. After, I guess it was 4 years, it's more than 60,000 people within Procter & Gamble.
Wow.
This was nobody. My friend Sir Ja, he was just a kid in his 20s who didn't like Milosevic. Not only did he overthrow the entire country, he created a series of revolutions called the color revolutions that are still reverberating today. Vladimir Putin is greatly diminished because of those 5 kids who met in that cafe.
Wow.
I can tell you, having researched this for 2 decades, story after story after story, it didn't start with somebody who had power, who was so much smarter. They just found a problem that they cared about, and they started and did the work to try and solve it.
Yeah, really quick. I see the back channels telling us we're coming up to time. So I want to first, just say thank you to Greg and for joining us and giving us his time. We wanted to make sure that you follow him. Follow his
new podcast. Amazing.
Yeah, a couple things here. His website. If you want to go to Greg. Is it Greg Satell?
GregSatell.com. Oh, and I forgot my my blog is digitaltonto.com. That's where I post every week. So I just put that in the private chat. But feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn. Always here to help and serve.
Yeah. Well, I wanted to just, make sure we got that. We probably need Russell on this conversation, have him.
Yeah. We need to revisit. Sure.
Yeah, because Russell was a big conversation here. And Russell and I have, passed messages back and forth on LinkedIn, and he's a good friend with Pumarega. So there's a lot of connections that I think would be really good. But I want to just throw this back to Nicole. I want to say thank you to Maya and Tina for always bringing up, conversations. I see the chat blowing up. 60 plus people were in and out of this conversation today. It felt a little like Clubhouse, so it's really good. So Nicole, I'll let you close it out, and we'll take it from there.
Yes. I think just to close it out, I always like to do a fill in the blank to kind of summarize our conversation here, or our view for what's to come. And for today, Greg, if you could fill in the blank, in order for change to be successful and sustainable in higher education, institutions must blank, or people must blank. However you might fill that in and leave our audience off today.
So if you can boil it down to one thing, it's about how you can empower people who want the change to happen. Find people who believe as you do, who you can never get people to do what you want, but you can find people who want what you want and empower them to succeed so that they can bring in others who can bring in others still.
Amazing. That was awesome. Thank you so much, Greg. I know if you have a few minutes, we usually just like to hang after, and if there's any last questions in the chat or anything. But for all tuning into SME Suite this month, thank you. This was an awesome conversation. I can't wait to go replay it and compare my notes and all these findings. And yeah, we really appreciate you being here, and we'll let you know what we have in store for next month shortly. Thank you, everyone.